it working? Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning and welcome to the Embassy of Sweden and this event, which is part of CEPA's annual forum. Some 160 years ago, in the 1860s, the British Prime Minister at the time, Lord Palmerston, received the first telegraph message ever sent to Whitehall. His first and spontaneous reaction was to say that, my God, this is the end of diplomacy. Whether this was an expression of joy and relief or of sorrow and grief, history does not tell. But as a diplomat myself, let me paraphrase another great thinker from the 1800s and say that reports of our death are greatly exaggerated. Diplomacy has survived the telegraph, the radio, the telephone, the faxes, and the internet. At the same time, there is no denying that technology has always been closely linked to diplomacy, for communication, for information, and now also as a subject matter in itself. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to open the inaugural tech conference of this year's CEPA forum. It also lines up well with the importance that we attach to tech issues at this embassy as a key part of Swedish cooperation with the US. I would also like to underline that the broad range of participants that are here today speaks to the importance of creating networks and collaboration across disciplines and sectors between academia, industry, and government agencies. Sweden has long been a leader in cutting-edge technologies, with a thriving startup ecosystem and a commitment to sustainable innovation. From telecommunications and fintech to green energy and AI, Sweden is a force to be reckoned with. In the 12 months that have passed since the last CEPA forum, we have, for example, held the first Swedish-US cyber and digital dialogue. We have signed a joint statement with the US on cooperation in advanced wireless technologies, 6G. And Ericsson and AT&T have announced a groundbreaking cooperation to build an Open RAN-based network in the US. The contract has a potential value of $14 billion over 5 years, and is one of the biggest deals a Swedish company has ever signed. Ambitions are also set high on the national level. Earlier this month, the Swedish government proposed the largest investment in R&D in our history, focusing on excellence in research and on innovation in emerging technologies. In addition, tech and security policy are rapidly becoming an integral part of our cooperation with the US in our new role as a formal ally inside NATO and within the framework of our bilateral defense cooperation agreement signed in December of last year. On the international level, we firmly believe that to maintain a competitive edge in technology, we must work together across borders, not only as a way to find synergies, inspiration, and economies of scale, but also to set and align standards that promote open and free, secure societies. Ladies and gentlemen, the agenda for today's event centers on the intersection between geopolitics and tech, representing a country with a small and open economy dependent on free trade and economic integration. I am particularly interested in the discussion on the trade-off between, on the one hand, treating tech as a national security asset, which is increasingly the case, and on the other hand, the need to maintain open markets as a way to drive innovation and competition. With that, let me just close the circle and again fend for my own trade. Bonus points will be awarded to all those highlighting the continued need and importance for diplomats and diplomacy in the digital age. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jonas, DC, and Wendell. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to partner with you and the embassy again. We have developed such a strong partnership, not just with you here at the embassy, but with Sweden more broadly at CEPA. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And this is our inaugural half-day tech conference as part of the CEPA Forum, which is our annual convening of transatlantic leaders and thinkers from Europe, the United States, and North America more broadly. I'm so really delighted to have this opportunity to have a follow-up conversation that we started last year, as you mentioned, Jonas, talking about the integration of new and emerging technologies into our future force capabilities. But CEPA broadly has focused on working on transatlantic technology cooperation as a big part of our mission. And we were founded almost 20 years ago with the very explicit focus to build a strong and enduring and democratic transatlantic alliance for future generations. Of course, defense, security, and our commitment within NATO is at the core of that alliance, but so are democratic values and principles, and so is cooperation and technology. Because if we don't get tech cooperation right, we won't be able to compete with China, first and foremost, but also with the forming alliance of authoritarianism that we are seeing emerge across the world that is challenging and undermining what has been a vision for a Europe whole, free, and peace, and a vision for the free world that the US has, of course, led for decades. So I was struck that President Biden, in his comments at the UN General Assembly this week, reflecting on his time of almost 50 years in public service, talked about the importance of this moment as a real inflection point in history. And I think that term gets thrown around in various ways quite often, but that is where we are, for better or for worse. And I think we have an opportunity together across Europe with our partners and allies to craft a future that will be governed by democratic norms, and to craft a future for the technology sector that will be governed by democratic values and norms, because values do flow through technology. We had a conversation yesterday with some colleagues from the US government, industry, as well as civil society, where that came out crystal clear. That technology is not neutral, it is also not benign. And when we allow adversaries who don't share values and principles to dominate the technology space, they also export their own vision of the world, and they export their own vision of digital authoritarianism. So that is where we are today, which is why this is such an important conversation for us to have here together at the embassy. As Jonas said, Sweden has been at the forefront of really understanding and harnessing the power of new and emerging technologies. We want to see a Europe that will not be struck by a competitiveness crisis, that will not suffer under the weight of heavy regulation, but a Europe that will be a strong partner for the United States and that will be able to lead in the space of technology innovation, and that will be able to defend itself by integrating new and emerging technologies into its defense and security capabilities. Of course, Ukraine has helped us see the importance of transatlantic unity, and we've done so much together to support Ukraine. But of course, that is not a job yet nearly done. And of course, President Zelensky is here in Washington today, and we'll see what the outcome of his meetings are at the White House. But I think certainly if we don't connect security, technology, democratic values and principles in a holistic and comprehensive vision for the future of our societies, for the future of the free world, then we will have a lot to lose. But I hope we'll have an optimistic conversation today. So with that in mind, it's just my pleasure and honor to be able to pass the conversation over for some introductory remarks from the co-chair of our International Leadership Council, our high-level advisory group at CEPA, Germany's former Minister of Defense, the co-chair of that advisory group, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. Annegret, please.
Hello and good morning, and thank you all for joining us on this morning. I'm very delighted to help open CEPA's inaugural tech conference on behalf of CEPA's International Leadership Council, which I have the honor to co-chair alongside General H.R. McMaster. The ILC is one of CEPA's 2 high-level bodies that produces annual reports setting priorities for the Transatlantic Alliance and our cooperation. It is composed of former heads of states, high-level policy, business, and thought leaders, including Sweden's former Prime Minister, Carl Bildt. So thank you again to the Ambassador of Sweden for the opportunity to partner with you today. We really appreciate it. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has highlighted the importance of resilience, the importance of being ready for defense, the importance of the US and Europe working closely together, not just to support Ukraine, but to harness new and emerging technologies to push back against authoritarianism and build an effective future force. We, Europe and the US, have a window of opportunity to build on decades of close defense and security cooperation. And this is needed, as well as today's conversations. They will speak to building innovative defense capabilities. And while there is still a lot of work to do, in Europe in particular, the Draghi report had just made it very clear, and the latest report of the Swedish Defense Commission on Swedish security policy has highlighted this as well. Thanks to Ukraine, and I have to admit that this sounds very bitter to my ears, but thanks to Ukraine, we are starting to work up to the need to invest in this capacity. And so, as I mentioned, we, Europe and the United States, have a window of opportunity to build on decades of close defense and security cooperation, to transform the Transatlantic Alliance with cooperation and cohesion on defense and technology at its heart. So this is what we are in together, what we are working on, what we are discussing today on a special aspect. And now it is my honor to hand it over to CEPA Senior Fellow and former Irish Minister for European Affairs, Lucinda Creighton, to begin the first conversation. Lucinda, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Fantastic. Good morning, everybody. It's my honor to be here. Thank you to CEPA for the invitation to be with you. I'm really excited that we have such a distinguished panel who I know are chomping at the bit to get into the nitty-gritty of transatlantic tech policy. I would like to firstly introduce our panelists, and then we'll kick off our discussion. I'm going to begin by introducing Nitin Natarajan, who is the Deputy Director, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. Ambassador Karen Kornbluh, Special Assistant to the President in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Peter Borsos, Head of Communications at the Ericsson Group. And finally, Aro Argonaut, a Director, Americas Public Policy at Amazon. You're all very, very welcome. And we have such a wide range of experience and depth of knowledge and expertise that we're going to have to pack a lot in the next 45 minutes or so. So obviously this session, I think that the scene has been set very well in terms of the challenges and the opportunities that exist. Europe and the United States are allies. We have common values, shared objectives, and I think what we would all like to see is that translated into tangible, concrete cooperation and action. And this is sometimes where we maybe fall down. So here we are today to try and solve this and come up with solutions as to how we can forge ahead in cooperation and partnership based on the democratic values that we share, which Alina has outlined so coherently already. So perhaps to kick off, I'd like to go to you, Nitin, and ask you, I mean, your agency has launched several initiatives, and one of the ones that I want to focus on initially is the Secure by Design rules, which go hand in hand with the recent ban on Chinese software and electric vehicles. So I suppose it's setting the tone, and I'm interested to hear from you. What are the industries, the strategic industries that you're focused on that you see as being critical to the future and in the context of the US and European partnership?
Sure. Thank you. It's great to have the opportunity to be here today and really talk about the strong partnerships we have with our colleagues throughout Europe and really the work that is a global issue. I think the challenge, we see Secure by Design not as a single isolated, obviously US issue. This is a global issue. We're all facing a lot of the similar adversaries. We're facing a lot of the same, we're using a lot of the same fundamental software and hardware, both in information technology and operational technology, and really making sure that we can transition some of that risk that to date has been placed on the end user, and really going back to hardware and software manufacturers to say that you need to be building more secure. You need to be building more secure by default as you come out the door. And I think it's a transition we're seeing in industry. And this is, again, something that when we've published documents about this have been global in nature with partners across Europe and across the globe. I think we initially were frankly uncertain on how industry was going to respond, but the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. We earlier this year came out with a Secure by Design pledge where we asked companies to publicly acknowledge their willingness to take concrete steps, some as early as within 12 months, to change the way in which they look at security in what they produce. We initially had around 80 or so companies sign on. On the first day, we're up to around 200 companies now. And we believe this will truly have an impact across the globe. This is not just about companies operating here in the US, but these are companies that are operating globally. And we think it is this transition that we're going to need as we look at the introduction of new technology from partners around the globe into our day-to-day lives. As we see the increase in technology in every sector, in every industry that we're dealing with, everything from healthcare to the energy sector, to food and agriculture, to IT and communications. So we really need to pivot the way in which the industry has been developing and creating products to help look with a stronger security lens to help all of us globally raise our overall resilience.
Karen, I might come to you to get your thoughts on where the EU and the US are in terms of convergence or divergence in this space, and also with the particular focus on AI, which is obviously hugely exciting, but is also causing quite a bit of anxiety. How do you see the best way to plot that forward to achieve common standards on both sides of the Atlantic? Is it through the OECD potentially? Is it through other fora?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for moderating us, and thank you to CEPA. You play such an important role in this conversation about tech and the transatlantic relationship. So thank you. I think TTC has played an incredibly important role in hosting discussions that are so important, especially in light of, the heightened awareness about our resilience and our need to think about technology and trade in the context of our democracies. The OECD has also played an important role in this, specifically in AI over the years, so starting back in 2019. But they have hosted this global partnership on AI, I'm going to get the acronyms wrong, and an observatory. The partnership, I mean, the OECD is this wonderful, nerd fest place where countries come to harmonize regulations, but it has been known as the rich man's club. And fortunately on AI, a new forum was set up that included 29 diverse countries, including Brazil and I think Senegal. And that's now been brought more into the OECD so that it'll have a secure funding source and technical ability. So that's going to be really important. But then, the Biden-Harris administration has made a big effort to work through the G7. There are these AI safety summits that have been happening. There's going to be another one in I think in mid-November in California, where the AI safety institutes from around the world are going to come together. And so I think Europe and the U.S. are leading in not, and then obviously the UN. I mean, we're in UNGA week, and the UN has not only come out with their global digital compact, but Secretary Blinken announced a big global AI research agenda and $33 million in grants to support the use of AI in sustainable development goals. So I think there's an effort by the US and Europe to use these various fora to bring in different countries and to push on this framework of safe and secure and trustworthy AI. But I don't think there's necessarily, one silver bullet, but all of these venues are incredibly important in fostering that conversation and promoting that framework as this new technology develops.
And when you look at those different international fora, I mean, I guess the intention, the objective is that they are complementary. And I suppose, is it a priority for the US to ensure that it's not just a transatlantic sort of initiative, but that you're bringing in other regions and other allies?
Yes,
locally?
and I think that's why it's so important that this OECD partnership is broader and has, many countries that are not members of the OECD, and also that Secretary Blinken announced this big new effort at the UN that's focused on the Sustainable Development Goals and bringing in other countries, and we signed on to the Global Digital Compact there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Aro, I might bring you in here to get your perspective. When you look at the transatlantic technology agenda, transatlantic tech cooperation, what are the objectives for Amazon, for your company in that space? What would you like to see evolve
if I had a magic wand.
If you had a magic wand.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, to you and to CEPA. It's an honor to be part of this inaugural session, and happy to see all of you interested in our conversation on transatlantic tech cooperation. I guess what I would say is, the relationship between the EU, us and EU, as people have said so far today, is really critical. It's sort of an unparalleled alliance, and we really view the private sector is a key element in that. Our industry cooperation and transatlantic economic ties are a huge pillar in that. And so when we look at future US-EU conversations or work together in whatever mechanism it is, we really hope that both governments will really take on sort of some of the bigger issues that have emerged in technology policy recently. what we should really be doing is trying to figure out ways that we can work together to ensure that both of our companies continue to be global tech leaders, and make sure that we're focusing on innovative policies that will promote that, and kind of staying away from policies that might limit the ability of companies on either side to grow and compete. So if I had a magic wand, I would say that solving those, finding common ground on technology policy in this sort of big way would be exactly what I would want to focus on. And there's some real opportunities here. I mean, take AI, as Karen was talking about. A study that Amazon commissioned found that if the EU were to take up responsible and pro-innovation AI policies, that would add about $600 billion to their economy, bringing a 3.4 trillion as the total for technology adoption in the EU. And so we would like to see focus on how to even grow that number and how to make technology adoption more effective for the EU and of course the US. On AI, I think we're so excited by all the things that the US government has announced and is working on with the EU. And I just would say that I hope that governments will also focus on every country around the world is currently thinking about what legislation they can pass as quickly as possible on AI, and I hope that these frameworks that the U.S. government is launching, including I think So Smart at the UN, but we would hope to also see in regional agreements like APEP, some rules of the road that will prevent a bunch of legislation from emerging around the world that would make AI adoption harder and just mean this technology would be less useful.
So you've alluded to a couple of big themes, fragmentation in a regulatory context. I'd like to delve into in a second. When you talk about the need to focus on bigger issues, obviously AI is one of them. Are there others that spring to mind that you would like to see, for example, the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, focusing on if it exists by 2025? Who knows what the future holds? But what are those big issues that you'd like to see the Transatlantic partnership address?
Well, I will say that for Amazon, we really hope that if it's not called the TTC, that a bilateral mechanism to talk about technology and trade continues. And we would like to see that work elevated even to more senior level political levels, because we think it is so important to the future of our partnership, not only our economic, but our national security, and would like to see that mechanism continue. I mean, when I talk about the bigger issues, I guess I'm talking about sort of really core, policy issues that have emerged over the years. Sort of the digital regulatory agenda that the EU has launched, which has been controversial for a number of companies, including my own. I think selfishly for Amazon, that's what we would really like to see, but I know that other companies and other sectors have other issues that they'd like to be dealt with that are not. I think the TTC was originally created in sort of with this mindset that let's take on some low-hanging fruit, let's focus on some outcomes that we can achieve to build confidence. And I think that's really important. From my days at USTR, I know that between the US and the EU, trying to find agreements and build confidence is important, but it's been a while since I believe the TTC needs to move on to the really thorny issues that we don't see eye to eye on and try to find common approach, because it's so important to our future alliance and the work that we're trying to do as allies.
Agreed. Peter, as our European panelist, I think it'll be really interesting to hear from you. We've obviously had a big week or 10 days in Europe with the announcement of Ursula von der Leyen's new European Commission, and just before that, the publication of the report which the President of the Commission requested and has been authored by Mario Draghi, the former Italian Prime Minister. The Draghi report points to, shall we say, some deficiencies in European competitiveness. I mean, it's a really stark diagnosis and a big wake-up call, I think, for European policymakers. So I think it would be very interesting to hear from you what your perspective is on European competitiveness and how Europe needs to step up and seize the opportunity with technology, trade, investment, and so on. Over to you.
Thank you so much, and as everybody has said, thank you so much for hosting me and for being here. Representing Europe on a panel like this today, being Swedish in the House of Sweden is interesting. Thank you for your words on our deals before. I thought it kind of shows the competitiveness of US versus Europe, because you were talking about a $14 billion deal that we have done in the US. We have not done any $14 billion deals in Europe, and we're not going to, because the equivalent size doesn't exist over there. It's too fragmented. So we've been very vocal in actually putting the risk up for Europe becoming an industrial museum if things doesn't change. And the Draghi report shows what has to be done to some extent. So the problem statement, I think, is there. As in, we know this. We have all the examples of how few companies of Europe are among the 50 or the 100 largest tech companies. Happy to say that some of them are Sweden, Spotify, for instance. But it has to come down to going from talking about it to some action. We do business in 180 countries across the globe. We have people, employees in 150 countries across the globe. We, of course, call Sweden our home market, but it's a tad too small for Ericsson. It's 10 million people. When I now visit Washington, I'm saying that America is our home market. I would want to call also all of Europe our home market, but we need a Europe that is competitive on a completely different scale than it is today. So it's good to have that problem statement from Mr. Draghi, but now we also need that to put that into action. I'm happy to say that Sweden plays a very constructive role in that.
Are there key recommendations in the Draghi report, or indeed from your own experience and observations, that you would like to see prioritized by this incoming European Commission?
There's some low-hanging fruit on competitiveness, for instance, on competition. I mean, Sweden has 4 CSPs or telecom operators. Here in the US, you have 3 main ones. The difference is, again, then size. All countries in Europe has 3 or 4. It's difficult to scale infrastructure when you're building, infrastructure for much less people. So that's an easy fix. So that, among other things. Regulations overall. Our CEO co-signed the Meta letter on AI regulations that they sent out the other week on. So and he brings all this up, Mr. Draghi, and now the new commission is coming in, and it will be very interesting to see what they do, but the importance is doing something. And I think that the US plays a very important role here. And I participated in a dinner yesterday with some of you were there, etc. And I find the US being kind of cute towards us Europeans. I mean, we see so clearly what happens in GDP growth, in productivity, and we need to get our act together. And I think the US in long term really needs a thriving Europe on the democratic values and on how the globe is kind of looking. So short term, we need your help to kind of wake up, and long term, we will try to be part of a Western alliance that really works.
I think that's a really interesting point, and we kicked off this discussion talking about democratic values, and that is what uniquely binds Europe and the United States. And obviously we have just had very important elections in Europe, European Parliament elections. We have ongoing elections in member states, and of course there's a there's a small election coming up here in the United States, I think, as well, which everybody in Europe is keenly anticipating and following. And I suppose maybe back to you, Nitin, because I know that you're charged with a lot of work around ensuring that that these elections are secure, that there's cyber safe practices in place, etc. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that? Because obviously we're talking about innovation and we're talking about competitiveness, but we're also very, very conscious of ensuring that we uphold these democratic values.
No, I agree. I mean, the need to maintain that democratic foundation of all our nations is critical. And so we've spent a lot of time focusing the last couple of years working with our local election officials. Throughout the U.S., elections are local in nature. And so really focusing on making sure they have the right information, the tools, the resources to strengthen their communities and their election process in a way that works for them, recognizing that every city is different, every state is different. We've also spent a lot of time working with them to educate the public on how elections work. I think that 20 years ago we weren't asking questions about how elections worked, and so I don't think it's something that people have become well steeped in. We spent a lot of time focusing on people understanding the election process, the electoral process, the role technology plays in elections, the role technology does not play in elections. How security is built into the process, how transparency is built in the process, how checks and balances are built into the process across the nation. And these are conversations we've had with a number of European colleagues as well, as they have either just gone through elections and we've been able to have conversations to learn from them. We have others that are facing future elections and want to talk about the lessons we're learning coming out of the next couple of months and be able to share that. But the fundamental approach that we're taking is really focused on education, both of election officials and of the public, looking at how do we conduct physical and cybersecurity assessments of our partners to make sure that they have the tools and resources to ensure that they have both physical security and cybersecurity, given that we've seen an increase in threats against election officials, and which to me is crazy. These are local family members, these are friends in our communities that are playing these roles that are being threatened, unfortunately. So really focusing on doing those types of assessments to help people identify the tools and resources that are needed, and doing that in a collaborative way, because we know, again, at the end of the day, the elections are local in nature. But I think what we have seen this year that, much differently than 4 or 8 years ago, as we look at the presidential election cycle, is much more collaboration globally and sharing of those best practices of how a lot of like-minded nations are looking at election security, and how do we do that in a way that is effective, but that also leaves the federal government playing the role that it should play and not having to play a role that it should not play.
And are you seeing interesting examples of best practice emerging in other parts of the world, or is America the kind of front runner on this?
I think we've seen some good practices coming out of Europe, especially on a lot of the education front. But I think it's still a little bit early to tell. I think the conversations we're having now is we want to share best practices. We're seeing elements. I think we're taking common approaches in some areas. I'm not sure we're at the place yet, and I think we probably will be the next 12 months to really see what some of those best practices are that we can be more vocal about.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting, and certainly wish you well with that. It's such an important challenge to meet. Karen, I might bring you in, and I'd like to look at, one of the things that has become a really prevalent trend in recent years is the move towards state subsidies. We've seen it in the European Union, we've seen it here, we have the CHIPS Act, we have the IRA, we have various mechanisms. Is there a risk that we end up competing with each other in a kind of a subsidy race, or is there a way? I know you've written extensively and you've a huge amount of expertise in the green economy. Is there a way that Europe and the United States can potentially create a transatlantic green marketplace, which is complementary and drives innovation and competition rather than sort of the sort of subsidy race that many have talked about?
Well, this is where the TTC is so important again, that even when there was some surprise in Europe about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of those subsidies. The TTC was a place where the transatlantic partners could come together, discuss it, come up with solutions. And now there's this, again, the acronyms, the Transatlantic Initiative on Sustainable Trade within the TTC, which is working on more sustainable, stronger, resilient transatlantic marketplace, and facilitating environmentally responsible trade in goods and technologies. And we're also working on the interoperability of digital trade tools. So all of that together, I think, means that we can work. It's obviously a process, but I think having a venue like that to talk these things through and come up with creative solutions, because we're obviously, as everyone on the panel has been saying, we're stronger together. And we have such an important trading relationship that if we can, and we not only have commitments to democracy and competitiveness, but to a clean energy future, if we can work those things through in a venue like the TTC, that's been very, very useful.
And I mean, so from what you're saying, it has been a forum to date where those kind of sensitivities as they've emerged have been able to be sort of worked through. Because I mean, in fairness, the TTC, I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of it from, external parties, academics, etc., who sort of, dismiss it and say, well, it just hasn't achieved its purpose. But maybe it's more discreet. Maybe it's not as loud or as obvious in how it does its work.
It seems to be a great venue for working again at this, in addition to the big pronouncements that come out at these summits, working through the working groups at the technical level, building trust, coming up with real solutions. So it may be that that's not as obvious, but I think there's been a tremendous amount of progress that's been made through the TTC. I mean, it doesn't include everyone, right? It's not legislators are not coming together there. It's just the executive branch. It's not our individual states. So it's got a focus, but it's been I think beyond the summits, there's also been, which have been very important, there's also been a lot of technical work that's moved the ball forward.
Yeah. I'll maybe pose a question and I'll allow whoever would like to jump in respond. But in her letters to her new European Commissioners designate, Ursula von der Leyen has called for a change to the future, the next phase, if you like, of the TTC. So she has outlined a desire to continue the technical level discussions on tech policy, but elevating the trade discussions to a political level. Does anybody on the panel have a view on that, whether that would be a positive step, or should that happen on both levels? Should there be a political engagement on tech and trade while continuing with the technical work at sort of civil service level? Curious if you've thoughts on that.
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
I think the call for more political level work, as I said before, is really important, because if this mechanism is going to be as effective as everyone would like, it does need to have, leader level input. I think I would be curious to learn more about what is that intersection between what is on the tech side and what is on the trade side, because I think that they're obviously intermingled. Technology is critical to every sector of the economy, and you don't really have, trade and technology is, critical to the trade agenda. I would worry that you would be getting, if you separated them out, you might have certain things that can be talked at that level and not. So I think there just need to be a lot of questions answered from a private sector standpoint on how that would work. But I think her thinking about making this into a really robust leader level organization would be welcomed.
Yeah, there are a few interesting things that have been taking shape. I mean, I suppose because our elections are behind us and we're now focused on this 5-year mandate. She has appointed Maroš Šefčovič, who's the longest serving EU commissioner, who's very, very close to the president. as responsible for the bilateral relationship. So he will be leading on the transatlantic relationship. That's new. I think that's interesting, and it's a bit of a statement of intent. Whether these announcements and initiatives make a difference, I think remains to be seen. But at least there's a little bit of impetus, shall we say, in that direction. When we were here at the CEPA forum last year, we had a lot of discussion about regulation in Europe, and it sort of was the topic. Fast forward 12 months, we have a lot of very heavy tech regulation, and you've alluded to it. There's a lot of fragmentation and a lot of challenge for global companies to navigate that. I'm curious to just get your thoughts on how or what can happen in the next 5 years, maybe to reduce the regulatory burden or to at least enable innovation and the advancements of new technologies while navigating these fairly onerous regulatory obligations. So,
for me,
yes, and anybody else who'd like to come in on that. But yeah, you first, Darryl.
Well, I think it goes back to some of the comments I made earlier about the US and the EU working together on pro-innovation policies. I mean, one of the things that we really loved about the Draghi report, and there were a lot of really interesting elements, I could go on and on about that, but is just its emphasis on how Europe should adopt productivity enhancing technology. And in order to do that, you really have to have a regulatory environment that encourages sort of cutting edge new technology development by companies from not just inside Europe, but outside Europe, and you have to create an environment that's conducive to that. You have to think about regulation. If companies don't want to launch innovative new services there because the regulatory burden is so significant, that is a problem for your innovation goals. So I would say that continuing to work on a digital regulatory agenda that is focused on how do we innovate, how do we ensure technology adoption and grow is the way to go forward, and maybe not sort of the approach to be the first out of the gate on regulation should be rethought.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Peter?
I would, of course, being from Ericsson, I would add connectivity into the mix. Since connectivity is so crucial in the most tech and most innovations anywhere, I think that's a place where Europe needs to start to see that we're falling behind, and we're falling behind fast. Not only the US, but other areas of the globe like India and what have you. So finding an easier way to regulate so that Europe becomes at par, at least, on connectivity is, I think, super crucial to find that competitiveness and innovation possibility for Europe.
When you look at the level of innovation in the US versus Europe, and this is, again, it's spelled out in the Draghi report, I mean, what are the things, on a simple level, what are the things that the US is getting right that Europe is not getting right? And what can we learn from this side of the Atlantic that can help to mobilize greater innovation and success in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's a multifaceted question. You have to have capital. Mr. Draghi points to a lot of these different things. Our part in the world is to help the telecom operators to build the digital infrastructure, and that has proven in all countries to help everything from democratization to being a basic human need to helping innovation. So that's what we do. I mean, and to get there, I think there's some really easy hurdles to take away, and that is how you regulate the competition authorities, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We have just a couple of minutes left on our panel, and I just wanted to see if there are any questions or comments from audience members. Anybody, if there are some, I can take a few together, or... Yes? Our president.
Well, I'm happy to just kick off the conversation. I was wondering, since we have all of you here, I was looking at some of the R&D investment numbers from companies. And of course, it's not a surprise that the top 4 are American companies that invest in R&D, and not just because we have representation. Amazon is by far the top R&D investor right now in R&D. And then after you get to the other 4, of course, number 5 is Huawei. And the list kind of goes on until you get to Volkswagen somewhere, still top 20, but like 17 or something like that. And I think this just speaks to what we're talking about, that we have this competitiveness crisis in Europe, that European companies and countries are not investing in innovation. So I think the question is there anything that the US government can do to work closer with our European allies at the governmental level to jumpstart more conducive, I suppose, approaches at the national level or the EU level, because the regulatory space at the EU level is quite complicated and quite heavy for companies to manage these days. Is there something we could be doing at the national level with our allies? And then from an industry perspective, is there something that US companies can still do to maybe jumpstart ecosystems in Europe? Are there specific countries that you would point to that you think are doing this particularly well? With the exception of Sweden, because we already talked about how amazing Sweden is. So I would love to hear that.
Great question and comment. I have another one over here, so I'll just take this as well, and then we can come back to the panel.
Hi, Dan Mullaney from Atlantic Council. So with the new commission portfolios, you have Sefcovic, who both has trade and a security aspect and a bit of tax. And he's reporting to a commissioner-designate, Séjourné, who covers industrial policy. The bundling of all those issues together, I wonder if that is sort of an interesting reflection of where the next commission might go. And then secondarily, there's the observation that some have made that the allocation of commission portfolios is such that President von der Leyen will have quite a bit of power because of the division of the portfolios and what that means. I mean, in the past, between President von der Leyen and President Biden, there was, I think, quite a bit of common ground in terms of our common challenges. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about those sort of 2 aspects of the next commission and what that might mean about kind of an integrated trade, security policy, and also stronger transatlantic alliance.
Yeah, great questions as well. Okay, I'll allow you to decide where you'd like to jump in, if at all. But we might start with the question about investment, and I think Alina makes a really good point about the need to jumpstart European investment, and it's clearly in the US interest for that to happen, to have a strong transatlantic partner. Are there things that at a federal level the US government can do to encourage that, to support that, or not? Anyone?
I don't know exactly what to do, but at Ericsson we spend $5 billion on R&D every year, which we think is a lot. It's 20% of our market cap. The technological leadership for a company who's been in business 150 years next year, so now I got that said too, is extremely important. But I think in order for it to become really big money, you also need the ability to scale. I mean, the American companies are bigger, and then you have more money and more resources to put in. So you have to let also companies scale, which is perhaps one of Europe's problems then, that we don't scale enough companies.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
No, go ahead.
I think we're looking at this purely, obviously, from a partnerships perspective. There's no federal R&D that's going to solve all of our problems in the space. It's not just the public sector or the private sector, but really looking at collaboratively. I think we're having the discussions with our European partners on how best do we make sure that we're collaborating effectively on efforts we have underway. I think the challenge at the end of the day is always on the government side, is always funding for R&D and how much do we actually have to invest? I think, but there has been intense investment by the private sector in R&D, and I think making sure that we have that effective collaboration globally to make sure that we are prioritizing those efforts in areas that are mutually beneficial to the public and private sectors are key, and those are some of the conversations we're having in that space now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to say, take the conversation the question in a slightly different way, which is that the U.S. Public R&D, traditionally, we had more public R&D than private R&D. That's been flipped. We had a big bump up in public R&D with all the legislation that was passed at the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, post-COVID, but that's not permanent funding. And so I think there's a big opportunity / challenge to make sure that we're still investing publicly in R&D. There's a pilot in AI specifically. There's a pilot called the NAIR, the National AI Research Resource, that is being piloted because compute is so expensive that researchers can't get access when they're trying to build new models, when they're trying to figure out how to test models. So that's an interesting place, I think, for some R&D. But just more generally, if we're going to have public uses of this technology, the new technologies, which we're all told and we all say are going to make such a big difference in health, in climate, in education, there does need to be research to make that happen. And so even in the U.S. side, I think focusing on that public R&D and making sure it's funded so we're not eating our seed corn is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's not a question of sitting back and saying, right, we're in a good place, but actually continuously looking to the future and ensuring that those competitive advantages continue, that there is investment, and in many ways, I mean, tax incentives obviously are a big feature in R&D as well.
I would just say briefly, I would add to that, look at compliance costs as well, because if you're spending all your money complying with new and diverse regulation, it could be hard to invest in R&D.
Yeah, agreed. Then I'll see one more question. I'll come back to you. 5 minutes left, but just to if anybody on the panel would like to address the question about the new European Commission and its direction and the alignment. I don't know how much you've looked at the sort of the allocation of portfolios. Anybody on the panel want to?
I'll just say in response to Dan, I think it's really interesting the point you made, and I think we certainly are thinking more and more about the intersection of trade and security, and so that may produce some interesting results.
Industrial policy also.
Yeah.
Well,
I might say on that, because I'm following it very closely, that I think it certainly we're seeing a much greater emphasis. The European Union launched its economic security package late last autumn, and this is going to be a key focus for the new European Commission. So I kind of feel like Europe is catching up a little bit with the US on this. This has been obviously a big feature and focus, and has been kind of intersecting with trade policy and industrial policy here for quite some time. And obviously the elephant in the room is China, where the European Union has kind of avoided dealing with the thorny issue of China, and that is changing. And member states individually are changing, and at Commission level, that's very apparent now, I think. So we're going to see a lot more synergy, I believe, between the US and the EU on economic security measures, on trade policy, and particularly on how we respond to the China threat. So things are changing, that's for sure. Final question or comment?
Hello, my name is Denis. Everybody speaks about Ukraine, and my question also about Ukraine, because I am Vice President of the Ukrainian League of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. First of all, I would like to express my compliments to Ericsson. This company always bring prosperity and technology to Ukraine. For example, interesting fact that the first telephone station was settled by Ericsson in 1900 in Kiev, in Ukraine. And my question, how to strengthen Ukraine with transferring new technologies now in this difficult situation, because development of the economy is one of the most important part of how Ukraine can win and how we can solve this conflict.
Great, thank you. I think that's actually a great one maybe to wrap up this conversation. And I think when we look at greater cooperation between Europe and the United States, Ukraine has definitely been a factor in pulling and bringing together the US and European Union over the past number of years. So while the situation is horrendous, there is that small silver lining, I think. So I don't know if anybody particularly would like to comment on that. Peter?
Well, I mean, thank you for the kind words, and we do what we can, and we continue to support with the technology we have. And to that extent, Ericsson has been doing that in many parts of the world for the past 150 years. It's a phenomenal story in itself. But we, of course, will continue to do that.
Great. Anybody else? Okay, I think we have a very short opportunity for a coffee break, and then we'll move on to the next panel. I just would like to really sincerely, we've covered a lot of topics. This is really broad and cross-cutting, as we all know, but I think your insights have been hugely valuable, and I really want to thank our excellent panelists, and thank you to the audience for your attention and for your comments and interventions, and we look forward to taking this conversation forward to the second half of our discussion after the coffee break. So thank you all very, very much.
Good morning. Welcome back to the CEPA 2024 Tech Forum. My name is Joseph. I'm a national security reporter at Politico. I write the morning cybersecurity newsletter. Here to my left, I want to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. First, we have Andrea Thompson. She's the CEO of Dakota State Applied Research Company and the former Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security at State. Okay. To her left, we have former Congressman Will Hurd, former member of Congress from Texas 23, and a former CIA officer focused on counterterrorism. All the way on the left, Dr. Lorenz Meyer. He's the founder and CEO of Oterion, a Western drone tech company, and the world's most used autopilot for drones. So thank you everyone for joining us. To get started, obviously there's not a lot of news going on these days, right? I want to reach out to I want to talk to everyone on the panel, and I want to get everyone's opinion here, and to start, so we get an idea of your opinions. What tech areas will best define the U.S. and Western future global relevance the most?
Great question. First, yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks to CEPA and for inviting us, for inviting important discussions. Thanks to those attending, looking to some familiar faces, and for our international partners, greatly appreciate you making the time, because this is a global challenge. This isn't U.S. only, so really appreciate it. When you talk about which tech will define the future, we talked a little bit beforehand in the green room. Whatever we're thinking about the future, we're probably going to get it wrong. We've learned that time and time again, but we get close. And so before I was in state, before I was a CEO of a startup, I did 28 years in the U.S. Army as an intel officer, where your role is to give predictive analysis to the commander so he or she can make decisions on the battlefield. Most of the times we got close, so this is similar for technology. We talked about, is it cyber? Then it involves, is it AI and cyber? Is it quantum? It's going to be post-quantum. And as we're working, so I'm affiliated with the university. Dakota State University is a small startup, the not-for-profit small business. As we train, educate our students, we recognize that many of the things we're training today may not even be relevant by the time they're leading companies in the tech space. So to me, it's not a technology challenge that's going to define the future. It's going to be people in our processes. So if we have that workforce development and the people that have the flexibility and the skills to adapt to those changing environments, I think that's what's going to define the future for us, workforce development. And I hope we talk more about that. Thanks, Joe.
Definitely. Congressman?
If I were to say what's going to drive or screw up the relationship between U.S. and Europe, I'd actually say it's interoperability. It's not any one of these particular tech. All of those things matter, right? Most people probably think, I was going to say AI. Quantum, I think, is the one thing that we're way behind. We thought, I think there's enough people in here old enough to remember Y2K. But the government spent $4 billion preparing for Y2K to have the year go from 2-digit to 4-digit, 4B, right? Like, quantum's gonna be even harder, but it's the interoperability issue, and it's interoperability on our systems, our devices, it's interoperability on how we understand privacy, right? The fact that Europe and the US from a regulatory and legislative perspective still don't recognize we agree on way more than we don't is problematic. And I think until our allies as a group realize that this isn't actually exponential change that we're seeing, it's hyperbolic change. So you get to infinity over a finite period of time. The amount of change that we're going to see in this next 43 years, I always use 43 because I start with the personal computer, like the amount of change we've seen since the IBM personal computer came out in 1981 to now is significant, and we're going to see 200,000 years of progress, not what we saw over the last 100 years. So if we don't get that right and move faster, fast beats slow, obviously. Big doesn't necessarily beat small, and it's a mindset that's going to get in our way.
Got it. Dr. Meyer?
So I think that interoperability is a great segue. So we built a common operating system for drones, and it's the common language for NATO, for US forces. We've been working with the DoD for the past 6 years. And now we're starting to work with European countries, Dutch, UK, Germany, and most notably being present on the battlefield in Ukraine. And Ukraine has one problem, 600 different drones manufacturers, models, it's crazy. They all speak different languages. It's Babylonian, and they can't bring it together within one country, and now we have NATO. So communication and interoperability is really important, strengthening the Transatlantic alliance with that as well. But that is like right in front of us, and arguably we should be concerned about that also with respect to Taiwan on a 2-year horizon. We've got to get ready. If we're talking not about what is required to be competitive for the near-peer adversaries on a 2 to 5 year horizon, but we go on a wider horizon, of course we should be worried about quantum computing. We should be worried about keeping the AI edge that we currently have. But I like to usually stick to where the tech area I'm a true expert in, and that's certainly around autonomy, drones, interoperability, and defense. And so I don't want to speculate what's all there, but what I do see, the sense of urgency of investing into technology and supporting the shift from manned to unmanned when it comes to defense, there's not enough urgency there.
And can I add on top of that?
Please.
Look, how are we ensuring you can do more, right? Like European-born, American-based, right, company that should be a model when you have the Chinese that have the edge on the actual making of the drones, and are we going to give them the same competitive advantage they now have in TCOM because we didn't help Ericsson and Samsung, right? It's like, why didn't 10 years ago did we not create tax policy in Europe and the United States to ensure that countries that were our allies and our friends were able to build a technological infrastructure with hardware that is based in an allied nation, right? Let's not make that same mistake now when it comes to the latest kinds of tech. And the battlefield now is swarms, it's drones, it's how we could defend against it. And it's not just about the Chinese using it, it's about the next terrorist who has 100K and can use a swarm to attack something in New York or Washington D.C. Right, and so we're not prepared for those kinds of threats.
Yep, and I want to get into that a little bit more, but first, Andrea, I want to bring you in here, and you obviously, we were talking about your unique experience, industry, State Department, and in the battlefield. So obviously we've seen the war in Ukraine change a lot of the way we do military operations. So tell me, what do you think it has been the biggest impact on the battlefield from what you've been seeing?
Well, so biggest is hard, right? Because that will change as the battlefield changes. Again, I find that, and it sounds simple, but conflict forces innovation. Conflict on the battlefield, conflict in business, right? It forces you to make change quickly, adapt, and maybe force you to do things that you wouldn't have normally done. Mm-hmm. From the Army, we saw that, again, when you talk Y2K, I'm like, you're talking lived that. So I've evolved from, I think about that. I was commissioned in 1988. My first assignment was in Germany when the wall was still up. Fast forward a few years later, was deployed in support of Iraqi freedom. Fast forward again, and so you look at that evolution, and I tell folks, as a lieutenant, I was training on Soviet order of battle, like doctrine. We're talking about, T-72s, like memorizing doctrine, memorizing what aircraft and tanks and capabilities. Irrelevant years later, right? Irrelevant. So when we talk about, what is that biggest change, it's how quickly can we adapt? And are there commanders and business leaders and government leaders that are willing to take that risk? I went from government, right, risk averse, to a prime, defense prime, very innovative, to now a small startup, and I'm finding that speed of innovation, it's going to come from industry, right? It's military is helpful, government helpful, but the speed of innovation and the adaptability on the battlefield is going to come from industry. And I hope we talk about it some more on those public-private partnerships, the importance of that. How do we get research from academia into the industrial base? How do we get it from small businesses? We're going to win through our small businesses. How do we fleet those up? So it's really that speed and that evolution of conflict that will define us.
I got it. And Congressman, obviously, everyone here should know we're about a couple weeks away from an election.
Is that still on? Is that?
Pretty sure, if my memory serves me correctly. Obviously, the results will mean that a new administration is coming in. You touched on this a little bit, but tell me, what are you hoping for either administration to focus on or prioritize? Obviously, you're a big AI, cyber, NatSec guy, so what are you thinking?
Here's what I'll say, regardless of who wins in November, directionally, preparing for wars of the future, preparing for great power competition is going to continue. Making sure we're focused on technologies. You know, I can speak from when I came into office in 2015, President Obama was focused on this, and then President Trump continued the work of President Obama, and then President Biden continued the work of Donald Trump. And so whoever wins, whatever new administration, you're going to see that. And I would say Congress recognizes a threat of China. What we do about it, there's still some question, and they recognize that technology is the future. Where we go, how we do that, we don't know. But I would like the next administration to be focusing on using the stuff. Okay, like everyone wants to talk about generative AI, right? And be like, oh my God, it's an existential threat. It hallucinates. Well, y'all were hallucinating before AI was, right? It's like, how many people have passed on a rumor at breakfast this morning, right? Or use some stat to win, misuse a stat to win an argument with your spouse, right? Okay, like that's hallucinating as well. So I think part of it is use it. And an example I use, Tony Scott was was he the first? I think he was the first chief information officer for the government under President Obama. And he came from VMware, and he was like, we're not using like two-factor authentication in government systems? Like what? And he did a 90-day push, and like all the agencies were forced to do that. Like I want to see something like that, especially when it comes around AI, using the stuff, because if you want to regulate it, you got to understand it intimately. If you want to limit the harms, you got to understand its potential. And so I hope the next administration is focused on using that, and we can take that to the DoD space as well too, making sure that we're moving these new technologies, that we're seeing the Ukrainians adapting on the battlefield, that we're going to have to make sure Taiwan is using to make sure that's being integrated all the way down the stack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Meyer, I want to bring the question over to you now. Obviously, Chinese-made drones dominate the market. Is that something you're hoping the next administration tackles? Obviously, drones have become a game changer in Ukraine especially, right?
So Chinese drones are actually the first category where China won, I would say, on merit, the race to consumer products, which, along with 5G, should really serve as a wake-up call. And I'm not clear if we've really fully processed what that means and what that could mean for other technology fields. Now, with the military usage, Ukraine is using this year somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million drones. That's actually a number that rivals consumer volume easily and is a factor 1,000 or more larger than what NATO is acquiring in the same period. And that's, of course, a game changer because industry works based on sales and volume, and that's driving it. At the same time, these drones are so inexpensive, they're $1,000 or less. In terms of DoD or MOD budgets, it's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. But we're not seeing right now the government really spending money on it, which is concerning because it basically means that Russia and China in the defense space start to pull away because the shift to unmanned is not really embraced yet. We see a lot of press and we talk about it, but in terms of budget allocation, it's not really happening at scale. And we're talking about each nation buying one fighter jet less to unlock the budget required. We're not talking about massive shifts. I think that's one thing. The other thing that I'm seeing, because I spend a lot of time in Kiev, I'm there every month or every other month, and then I'm spending time here, I'm spending time with Bundeswehr, with the Dutch forces, and so there are different, I would say, intensities and velocities. It's definitely a joy to work with the forces in Ukraine, with the Unmanned Systems Directorate of the General Staff. The urgency is there. We call this the speed of relevance for the conflict that they operate on, that we operate on. That needs to sink in, because we're after World War II and after the hate of the Cold War. World War II gave us airplanes. The hate of the Cold War gave us GPS, internet, microchips, a whole number of innovations we don't embrace. We're now in a third cycle with the war in Ukraine, and it's powering the shift from manned to unmanned. And a reasonable response would be to see 10, 20, 30% of NATO budgets moving to unmanned, but that would mean that they should be flowing billions of dollars into that field, which they're not. And so switching to this sort of wartime mindset, to that urgency, I think is absolutely essential, because if we don't, then we will lose Taiwan.
And if you're not buying them, you're not using them, you're not developing tactics, techniques, and procedures and how to use it against your adversaries. And you can, the Russians go back to Syria in the use of autonomous vehicles and electronic warfare. So they are years ahead in the application of these tools into the battlefield. Now, they're not doing they're not being the greatest at that application, but they have that experience. And so if we don't have that, and it goes back to another issue you asked on the question to me was, what can this place do? Pass a freaking budget. Right? Now, I'm of the opinion, and this is coming from a former appropriator. All my appropriator friends are going to get upset with me. We should have we should pass appropriations for 4 years, right? And let an administration that still has a role for the Appropriations Committee, let an administration have the ability to think through for at least 4 years. It takes there is zero motivation to innovate, to save, to build for the future. And you got to give them that tool. So 4 years is never going to happen. I could probably accept 2 for one new Congress, but that is such an important piece. Now, does Europe have these same problems? I don't understand. My friends at CEPA can explain that to me. But that is something that is ultimately getting in the way, because you do not have the life cycle to give innovative technology companies the ability to grow and to scale at the speed in order for you to do this. And then when something negative happens, that's when we're going to try to rush, and you don't have the entrepreneurs there to be able to build these things.
And if I can just build on that,
Please.
second and third order effect, if you're a big prime, you can probably muscle through a tough year. If you're a 100-person company or a 200-person company or an innovative 500-person company, it may end you, because it has that trickle-down effect. Mm-hmm. So because the large prime doesn't want to accept that risk because they're uncertain of the budget, so they may not partner with a new company. So you stifle, it dies. There's so many innovative technologies with leaders and these ideas that don't survive to year 2 or year 3, because starting out you are dependent on a medium-sized company or large. So it is hard. I will tell you that as a CEO of the new startup, I started November 1st. Coming up on the 1-year mark soon, and there's just not been that predictability. So we have engagements with these companies that go, oh my gosh, you can help me with my cybersecurity shortfalls and my talent pipeline and my XYZ challenge, but we're kind of in a wait and see mode. So I would say that second, third order effect, as a US, maybe big companies can weather that storm, it will kill small, medium companies.
Mm-hmm. Talking about cybersecurity, obviously, this war in Ukraine kicked off with a massive cyber attack, right? And here in the U.S., we have a massive shortfall in cyber talent, right? Well, maybe not in talent, but in positions being hired. I believe it's about 500,000 right now. Obviously, Andrea, we were just hearing from you. You're South Dakota now. Is Washington doing enough to foster talent from outside of those big hubs in Silicon Valley, Washington, other places?
So we have how much time?
Take all the time.
I yield the balance of my time.
You do my colleague from Texas. So we talk a lot. We're in the former government, like a lot of talk about it, right? Everybody's in. Everybody wants to move. Everybody recognizes it. I think the number's close. Again, fuzzy math. 700,000. I've heard 750,000. Just here in the U.S. alone, I think it's 3.5 globally. So this is not a U.S.-only problem on our workforce development. So they talk about geographic diversity. Again, not to make this personal, lived in D.C. the last 17 years through my military time, industry time, government time. Just moved back to my home state of South Dakota. Come visit, call me, I'll show you the state. Moved back to there in April of this year. You wanted geographic diversity. We have almost 100% placement from Dakota State University in our cyber program. It's a national center of excellence for NSA. It's a national center of excellence for DHS. It's been a computer and cyber science program for 40 years. It now has AI programs. We're just starting with quantum. And how hard is it for the Applied Research Corporation for that university to get a contract? It is excruciatingly painful. And we run into this cycle, going, wait, you have a cyber shortfall. I have 200 graduates, scaling to 400 graduates in the cybersecurity realm alone, and we can't contract? There is a systemic flaw when that is occurring. So again, we talk about geographic diversity. When you talk to companies about maybe move out of the NCR or Austin or Palo Alto and come to South Dakota or anywhere in the Midwest and start up, they become risk averse. There are those bold companies that have done it and go, oh wait, my employees can afford housing, great strong public schools, I can bike and walk to work most of the year. No state income tax. And again, they're all cleared. My entire team has clearances because it's good quality young people. I've now maybe jinxed it, but but good quality young people. So all I'm saying is they talk about geographic diversity. They talk about the talent shortfall, but we still are a risk-averse government. We still are a risk-averse big businesses. So there's much work to do here. But again, it goes back to people. It goes back to the talent.
Congressman, please, I want to, just thinking about that. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot about Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon recently, I think Salt Typhoon, too many typhoons.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm wondering with this, workforce shortfall that we're having right now, I wonder if you could give us a little threat assessment of what you're seeing out of this and, what that might bode for, our European colleagues here too.
Sure. It's only going to get worse, by the way, right? You're increasing the surface area of attack. So increased interconnectivity, good. Right, love that, but that means there's more things you can hit. You also have a standardization of some of the guts of the internet and computer systems, right? And then you have entities like your energy and water moving to broader software that hackers know how to get into. So the surface area of attack is only going to increase, right? How do you and can NSA is designed to help the .mil and the intelligence community, DHS and CISA, which by the way, I was proud to be one of the folks that helped create CISA with Mike McCall. This was Mike McCall's baby, my friend from Texas. And I think CISA has done a really great job of providing a service to the rest of the .gov space. How do you address these things? Cyber National Guard. If you're a kid and you want to get a cybersecurity degree and go work in the government, Uncle Sam's going to give you some scholarships, right? And then you're going to come in and work for at least 5 years or twice the amount of years of scholarship money that you get. And then after that period of service is over and you go work for a great company, that company is going to loan you back for X number of years. Look, there are things that can be done in a finite period of time that if you have people that have an understanding of the organization and experience, but and introduce those people. Now, I tried to do this and pass this legislation when I was in Congress. One of the problems we ran into is background checks. Like, why does it still take 9 months to do a background check? Right?
Yeah.
Do you really think the dudes I lived next to 10 years ago is going to have any unique insights onto whether or not I'm a risk to working in the federal government? No, right? But all the crap I do digitally, like that we have access to now, we should be able to do this in a day, right? In order to facilitate that movement. So that's how we increase the intellectual flow between the public and the private sector. You have great young people come into the value of learning your career in cybersecurity in the federal government. It's a scale that you don't see anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And that's valuable whatever company you go to. And then those companies that they're now working for, when they see, oh, this is what's really happening, we can provide better services into the government. That's the model we need to get to. But it's so hard for people to think, who holds the clearances, right? Like, how do you do this long term, right? Like, can you do something only in 15 days, right? Like, we got to get beyond that because the threat is ultimately too significant.
Of course, and you want to go ahead, Andrew?
Oh no, I was got an amen, got a hand in the air on that one.
Yeah.
Dr. Meyer, obviously, when we think about these security concerns coming from China, obviously we have to think about security concerns with drones. China investing heavily in autonomous weaponry. What's your take on security fears coming out of Washington?
When you say security fears, you mean in defense? Or
I mean in cybersecurity concerns with drones.
Cyber with drones. Okay, so I think let me sidestep the question a little bit. When you talk about not cyber but China as a threat overall, there is definitely a supply chain threat, and I think the events in Lebanon have taught us a lesson about supply chain, and we have that supply chain in commercial drones here. We don't have necessarily alternatives that are domestic. That is a part of the industrial base that needs to be built. And I believe 5G is another great example where we were way behind the curve, corrected late, way behind the curve. So I think looking at technology supply chains geostrategically needs to happen much, much harder. And what I find so interesting is that we are admiring the problem, including in events like this. And there are problems that are expensive, like chips, the CHIPS Act. Takes a lot of money. There are problems that are cheap. The drone supply chain is nothing. Dozens of millions already move the needle. Hundreds of millions completely change a game. Those are not big amounts on a geostrategic scale. So I think being a lot more pragmatic, and what I actually love about the approach of the government here is they start to adopt supporting industry, the supply chain, the American supply chain, and using the support of Ukraine as a means to basically say, like, okay, we can actually solve two problems here. Number one, we can build a domestic base. And number two, we can support Ukraine by supplying not just drones, but also American components for drones, critical components like AI targeting computers and other things, to our Ukrainian partners. And that increases domestic capability with a flexible funding mechanism that is way more lenient than the regular acquisition process. I think that can be actually an example for all of NATO, where all of the NATO partners could basically say, like, what do we have in terms of our capabilities that we can contribute, and how can we provide those to Ukraine and at the same time bring up our base. So I think that's a wartime thinking that needs to set in a lot more, because there are all these budget mechanisms now that actually allow you to move quickly that could be used where it's not just drone parts, it's also cyber capabilities where we could defend, or I would rather say establish deterrence and at the same time bring up domestic capabilities.
Andrea, I want to pull you in here. How realistic is it to be more domestically focused on, building our base, or NATO focused? And also, I want to obviously hear your opinion on Volt and Flag Typhoon. If you could throw that in somewhere.
I'd like to talk about the part about interoperability and working together. And what I've learned, again, using those chapters of my life, with my time in the military, whether it was deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan, whether it was my time in government, at the State Department, trying to move policy, or now working with partners, is we are stronger as an alliance. You cannot go it alone. Like I said, we've seen it. So people talk about the U.S. doing this and others doing it. Our competitive edge is because of our alliance. When we talk about China, when we talk about Russia, when we talk about North Korea or Iran, what sets us apart is we don't go it alone. And so I find that in areas, so what can we do to expand interoperability? So it's not only our NATO partners or others in the Indo-Pacific, right, broader. And I think that's an area for the next administration to build upon the work that's been done. There's been some, we talked about norms of responsible behavior. Talk a little bit about, at the rate of business or the pace of business versus the pace of government. I raised in this early summer of 2018 to Secretary Pompeo that we should have a cyber bureau in the State Department. I said, we have pockets all across the State Department, but what if we consolidated that and moved forward for those technology policy ideas with our partners? It was going to be called the Cybersecurity and Emerging Technologies Bureau. He said, great idea, Andrea, run with that. So we formed, what would that bureau look like? And how much would it cost? And what's the right skill set? We took it to Congress, where it got bogged down for, I stopped counting, months, years on.
Sorry about that.
No, well, you trust me, Will Hurd was not part of the problem on where it got placed, where within the State Department. So again, silver lining, it was 2022, right? The Biden administration that said we're going to have a cyber and digital policy bureau. Ambassador Nate Fick, if you don't know him, meet him. Amazing leader. Again, his experiences, right person for the right job. But think about that, from ideation in 2018 to execution in 2022 for something as important as cyber policy and now AI policy, right? We're tracking it up at UNGA this week. Discussions being made. So we've got to get better with the rate of that coordination, or we will always be behind. Mm-hmm. Always be behind.
Congressman, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, look, so you need to have the people that need to use these tools being the ones responsible for purchasing these tools, right? And I love always being back in DC because every conversation turns into IT procurement, which I was the IT procurement guy, right? And so. Like we try to empower CIOs within agencies to get the digital tools they need, but when it comes to a warfighter, that general should be the one that makes that decision, the branch chief within the CIA who has unique challenges and a unique tool that can fix it. We need to give that authority to the person that's using it rather than bifurcating it. Only in government do you have that. And in a time when we can have transparency in purchasing, you don't need to have some of these archaic steps that were put in place to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. And so these are some of the tools to make sure the government is being efficient, right? And I would say at a time when trust in our institutions is eroding, right? All of our institutions, government at the federal, state, local level, the medical community, science, business. The reason there's erosion of trust is because they're not providing what they're supposed to. And so if we get the government to start being a little bit faster on these things, it's going to solve a whole lot of problems and make sure that we can prevent threats and also ensure that this experiment we call America continues to exist. Oh, and by the way, help our allies as well.
Do you think this the pager explosions in Lebanon maybe kickstarted any of this conversation in NATO countries or over here too?
Look, I think it makes it real, right? Like it makes it real for people. So if you go back to West Texas and be like, we need to fix a supply chain of software, people are like, what the hell does that mean? Pardon my language. And so that was that's a real idea, that's a real thing that actually happened, that people are like, oh, I can see the problem in this, right? Now, the one word that we should all be thinking about is out innovating, right? Like the only way we're gonna win this is out innovate, right? If you say, okay, you're not gonna be able to use our tools, guess what? Things are moving too fast, they're gonna develop their own tools, right? Huawei is the largest telecom provider in the world, right? They're the second largest provider of smartphones. They have their own operating systems. The Chinese are gonna figure out how to get generative AI working and be competitive with us, right? So how are we making sure that we're providing something that is better, cheap, less expensive, that people want to ultimately use, right? And more people would rather buy from us in Europe than they would from the Chinese. And so how are we ensuring our policies, our tax policy specifically, is conducive to that? How are we using the purchasing power of all of our governments to provide a market signal to companies and businesses to say, hey, this is where you should grow? How are we also using that purchasing to provide some stability for cash flow for some of these companies to develop this stuff, right? Like these are things that a government should be able to do. And then how are we ensure we're educating our policymakers so that the policies and the regulation of all this stuff should work? Look, I'm not one of these that's saying, oh, no regulation. No, someone needs to come in and say, don't do this, right? Because it's bad for the population. So those are some of the steps I think next whoever comes in November should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what the original question was. So.
You nailed
We're passionate.
it.
We're passionate, right?
So, Andrea, you and Dr. Meyer obviously are in the tech industry bubble, right? I just want to know how you think U.S. tech can help NATO countries in a more meaningful way. Obviously, we have here in the U.S. A big-time collaboration effort between the government and the private sector, way more than it used to be, just like in the last 10 years, right? So tell me a little bit more.
From the tech sector or from just writ large U.S. to our allies?
Whichever one's easier.
Well, I think they're both hard. So examples, again, when my State Department hat, I was Undersecretary, I was T, Arms Control and International Security, so export controls. Foreign military sales, direct commercial sales was under my purview. That stymied initiative. It stymied initiative. Again, a system that was put in place, right? You want oversight, you want to make sure the end user is using that equipment for what they purchased it for. But so many layers added to it throughout the years, it became insurmountable for key partners and allies to use our equipment or get our equipment. We have seen some movement on that. I use AUKUS as an example. Again, not the end all be all, but AUKUS Pillar 2 and announcements work between the UK and Australia on reforming ours and at nations at home, it was where other nation states as well, on export control reform. That is just one part of the process, but at least opens up that possibility. When we talk about setting up companies in Ukraine, when we talk about setting up companies, and goes both ways, right? What our partners and allies are here that say, "Why I want to open my company in the U.S., bring my equipment to the U.S." That is, the layers of bureaucracy are so deep. It really does back to the initiative. I don't have a legal team of 10 export control subject matter experts, right? I don't have the depth of policy, and not many do. And so you just kind of go, well, it looks like it's going to be U.S. only because that's what we can do. So there again, back to continuing to push on this reform, so we can get the best and brightest of the U.S. to partners and allies, and vice versa. And I won't bring up immigration, but right, we're not going to solve this talent shortfall organically.
Dr. Meyer, correct me if I'm wrong, your drone software is in an open source nature, am I right?
So I built the world's largest open source developer base. The company's product, it sits on top. because we're building targeting systems in Ukraine. We're not open sourcing targeting systems. That would be not a great idea. But what I can say, and that's by the way true for computing overall, because all of cloud computing is built around open source software, there is a ton of technology that is the fundamental base and that's shared. And by the way, there are export control exemptions for open source software in pretty much every jurisdiction. That solves also a lot of problems. But what we do is proprietary. I think the way we can operate as a software company, export controls are less of an issue. Of course, we have to comply with them. But we found a way to be compliant with German, US needs very efficiently.
Okay, everyone, we're getting ready to open the floor to questions. But while you start percolating some thoughts on what you want to ask everyone, I just want to ask one more question to Congressman Hurd. Obviously, you were on the OpenAI board. At some point, we're seeing a lot of turnover there now. Tell me, how do you square that role with calls that some in Washington want to regulate AI companies more?
Look, I've always been clear that there should be some focus and regulation of AI. I always let people know I was on the board of OpenAI before the coup. Okay, and look, and it starts with something very simple. AI should follow the law, right? Why do we have $1 trillion cybersecurity industry, or multiple $1 trillion cybersecurity industry? Because in the 70s, we carved out software from product liability loss, right? Why do we have social media that's causing crazy harms to teenage kids, increasing self-harm? Because we carved social media out of the laws that protects, CNN and Washington Post and everybody else has to follow. So let's not do that with AI. Follow the law. Mm-hmm. It's illegal to not give somebody a loan because of their color of their skin, right? So if that banker is using a tool the right way, or they're not using a tool the right way and they're using some AI tool and they deny that person, it's that banker's fault. But if that banker uses the tool the right way and the AI system discriminates against that person, it's the developers of that AI's problem, right? It's going to make you have to ensure that your stuff works a little bit better than in another scenario, but we should start with that. Mm-hmm. And really powerful AI. Europeans have made a decision what they think really powerful AI is. I think it's 10 to the 29th flops. Something that was trained on 10 to the 29th flops. What does that mean? That means the amount of calculations the computer did in order to get to that thing was of a certain size. Roughly, it's something that would have required about 200,000 megawatts of power. Mm-hmm. If you're two gals in a garage, you're not building an AI system with 200,000 megawatts of power. It's not going to impact you. But if you're a powerful AI, you should have to go through some kind of entity that opens the hood, looks under, and says, "Hey, okay, you're following some of the best practices on how to on what we know to ensure this is not going to harm people." Right? NIST is capable of doing that. Pump them a little bit more money, get them a few more people in order to do that. You do those things, right? And start using it more. Mm-hmm. So I was the gold standard of constituent relations when I was in Congress, because my response time to a constituent that reached out to me was 7 days. I think 7 days is pretty crummy, right? Like y'all will get pissed if if you texted one of your friends and it took them 7 days to respond to you, right? But that's like the gold standard. We should be able to do that in a day. AI can help you with that. Why are we not using more of that in order to communicate with our constituents, right? And so again, use it, right? Really powerful stuff. Be like, hey, let's double check your work, right? And make sure it follows the law.
Okay, thank you. Questions from the crowd? I see someone in the back. Okay.
Right here, this guy right here. Yeah.
Yep.
Hello.
Hey.
Mrs. Thompson, you used to be...
Sorry, before you start, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Liam. I'm a student at George Washington University. I also run an AI safety group on campus, so I'm so happy to be here and thank all of you for all the work you're doing. Mrs. Thompson, I want to address this at you. Used to be Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, so I want to know your thoughts on the prospects for AI arms control with China around lethal autonomous weapon systems in particular, and also frontier models in general. Do you think that cooperation with China is realistic, or do you think there's just not enough mutual trust for that to be possible?
Oh, great question, Liam, and we're hiring. So no, brilliant question. I will do my best to give you some insight. Again, having been across the table from the Chinese and the Russians as we try to negotiate or renegotiate arms control treaties, my sense is, again, more power to Bonnie Jenkins, Undersecretary Jenkins, and others that are doing God's work, that I think those days are behind us. But the responsible use, and back to Will's comments on norms of responsible behavior, I think we can get to yes there. And we socialize those discussions. Again, I'm no longer in government. I'm quite positive that they're continuing to have those types of discussions. But I think we should all agree that there are norms of responsible behavior. And that is, I've said it again and again to my Chinese and Russian counterparts. Your behavior is not, you wouldn't do that to a colleague, a peer, a family member. That is not responsible behavior, what you are doing. And that was we had talked in the initial, it was cybersecurity. So back to UNGA, back to the UN, we did work there as well, bilaterally, and then through the alliances and others to have that discussion. So do I think there should be an arms control treaty for AI? I do not. One, it'll become irrelevant. We'll get bogged down in discussions that I feel like by the time the government gets to a place, the technology will have evolved 5 different times. So again, back to that pace of bureaucracy. But we have to have those discussions and those with our partners and allies so they're hearing it from all sides on norms of responsible behavior. So we don't stifle initiative, right? We don't stifle the innovation for our partners, but we have that red line going. It's like, no, we don't do that. And there should be repercussions and there should be consequences for that type of action.
Can I add 30 seconds?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Whoops, absolutely.
So the Chinese have to be willing to have some kind of conversations, right? The problem is they're not. And so should we have more track 2 conversations on this? Absolutely. I don't think there's any track 2 where former Chinese government officials are talking with former US officials, where before they have conversations, they're talking to their people to be like, give me a left and a right. None of that is happening. So I don't think that we could get there. However, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was literally negotiated at the height of the Cold War, where it was the most bellicose rhetoric that had ever happened between the United States and Russia. And I bet you at that time, I haven't seen the archives to figure this out, people are probably like, no way, right? Are y'all gonna do that? But the United States and Russia was able to negotiate that thing. What's in it is the hard thing, because this is moving so fast, but those kind of conversations should happen. The problem is not the US and Europe trying. The problem is that the interlocutor on the other side has not shown a willingness and a seriousness in pursuing those kinds of conversations.
Okay, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. We have one person over here.
Musa Hakim Jr. with Lazy Moose Co. Working blockchain. I'm gonna ask earlier if we sell guarding tools and like that, so sorry if the name's confusing. So blockchain is an emerging technology, right? Some people will say it's old technology, depending on who you talk to. When we look at these technologies that come and evolve, and like you mentioned, the next 50 years will be 2,000 years worth of innovation, how do we, from a private standpoint, work with the government to remove some of these bureaucratic roadblocks that have been around for thousands of years? Like, how do we, is it possible to use the technology to societally move forward so we don't run into so many roadblocks that stop people who want to just put their head down and get it done?
Anybody want me to take that one?
I think it's
Look, so You allude to something that's going to ultimately impact us in this new Cold War that we're having with the Chinese government, and that is a future inability of the United States to use economic sanctions as a tool against our. That's the go-to that us and Europe want to use. And if you have the Chinese government, the Russians, the Iranians, and a lot of other folks going to an international system that moves moves renminbi faster than we do, that's going to take away our tools. So blockchain has an important role in that. That's super complicated. Here's what I have found, and what I can say about my colleagues and former colleagues. They want to understand the current trends that's going on. They just need people that have the ability to educate them, right? And so who is that champion that you can work with to say this is why this matters, puts it within a context, and then give them an ability to go back to their home district, talk about this is why it's important, this is what I'm doing about this. And so that's how we as folks that are outside of government can be influencing it to make sure they're talking about the right things. Don't give a 22-page term paper, right? Give a half a page that has 3 bullet points, right? You know, and pictures nice, right? I'd even take graphs over pictures, but that's how. So there's a willingness, right? And you got to engage with people and give them some context. Don't make them figure out why it's important. You got to explain to them, this is why this is important, and here's some ideas you can do about it. And it's not admiring the problem that we were talking about and saying, hey, here's one thing that you can go do. That's how, and people are going to always be receptive of that if you explain it to them, and they can go back home to explain it.
We have one question back there. Anyone else? Okay.
Hi, I'm Philip Shishkin. I'm a former reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and now just a consultant. I have a question for Lawrence. There was a report on Reuters news agency, I think yesterday, saying that Russia has established a covert program in China to manufacture at scale, I think it was a Garpia G3 long-range attack drone. Had a lot of specificity in that story. So assuming that this is true, I'm wondering, what do you think the implications would be for the unmanned battle space in Ukraine? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. I personally believe that we should look at Russia, China, and Iran as an integrated technology ecosystem and supply chain. It's one. It's not 3 countries, it's one. And they've integrated at a pace that NATO has not achieved, even though there is an alliance. And you should absolutely, like everybody should absolutely expect for China to support not just the Russian supply chain right now, but also to learn every single lesson out of Ukraine at a pace that thankfully we and a few other companies are learning too and are bringing back to domestic capability. The systems we're currently using in Ukraine are suitable in nature also for the third island chain in the Pacific. But they're doing that too. And so to me that sounds totally credible, and even if the report is, like, that will happen if it doesn't already happen. We should expect Chinese technology to be available at scale. And the concern we should not just have is like, hey, we need new technology. The concern we should have is our troops in the Indo-Pacific will face autonomous Chinese weapon systems, certainly, in 2 years. And so the question is not anymore, how can we deter China with our own autonomous systems? It's more like, how do we keep our sailors alive against that new threat?
Thank you. Time for one more, but we have to keep it short.
Thanks. Alina Polyakova. I'm President and CEO of CEPA. I just wanted to bring back the conversation a little bit to Ukraine, that you just answered the question, Lawrence. Because in the past, we've talked a lot about, on this panel and elsewhere, about the speed of adaptation and how we're not really set up, not just as the U.S. government, but also our defense industrial base is not really set up for speed in a lot of different ways. And I think a lot of the big primes, Andre, that you were mentioning, have learned those lessons the hard way when they were asked to ramp up production, and then it's like we were just like stuck when there's a land war happening in Europe. And when you go out to the battlefield in Ukraine, and Lawrence, you spent a lot of time going back and forth in Ukraine, in and out of Ukraine. I was just there a week and a half ago, and one of the things I heard from the Ukrainian government that I was pretty shocked to hear, honestly, is that they anticipate in 2025 of having the ability to produce in their entire defense industrial capacity $30 billion worth of capabilities. Primarily that's in the drone space. But they also said that right now they only have and anticipate having contracts, meaning money, for like 8 billion of that. So there's this over 20 billion gap in what Ukraine is able to produce, and potentially not just supply for themselves, but for maybe even Europe, and be complementary in areas where our primes just don't have the comparative advantage, right? Because you're really
sorry
good
to cut you off. Just cut.
I'll finish.
Yeah.
So there's this situation in which we are really good at building these exquisite weapons. There's an opportunity in Ukraine, and I'm just curious, how do we think about in a real way the acceleration of that speed? I don't want to get into ITAR and procurement and all this kind of stuff, but what are some concrete things that we can do? And Lawrence, I'm curious if you heard that number too on some of your last travels over to Ukraine, and what do you think about that?
A question of
because
speed.
I was pretty shocked.
A question of speed.
Yeah, question of speed and question of answering speed. Yes, Ukraine has told us consistently over the past year that they only have about 40% of funding compared to their capacity. And I think we in the West, across NATO, are admiring the problem of capacity here, capacity there, and Ukraine has capacity, and we're just not putting the dollars behind it. And it's not big amounts in absolute terms. And that's why I keep running around and telling everybody, buy Ukrainian, because you get better capability, combat proven. There should be more collaboration to bring Ukrainian capability into NATO, the same way as Russian capability is brought into China. And yes, I think it's totally credible. And when we have conversations in Kiev, it's always around budgetary limitations, because there's more technology right now available than is actually funded.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We had a great morning, lots of insight here. Thank you to CEPA for hosting us. Thank you, the Embassy of Sweden. That concludes the 2024 Tech Forum at CEPA. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Joe.